Welcome to the 5 Books for Catholics podcast, where experts explain their pick of 5 outstanding books on an aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. Jacques Maritain, 1882 to 1973, was an influential Catholic neo-scholastic philosopher and multifaceted public intellectual. Raised a Protestant, he became an agnostic. A student of the natural sciences at the Sorbonne, he grew disillusioned with scientism and even entered into a suicide pact with his wife, Raisa, to be carried out if they had not discovered a deeper meaning to life within a year. The lectures of Henri Bergson helped them find some deeper meaning to life and prompted Maritain to study philosophy. In 1906, he and his wife converted to Catholicism. The following year, he discovered St. Thomas and would dedicate the rest of his life to promoting and applying Aquinas' thought. Ambassador of France to the Holy See from 1945 to 1948, he joined the Little Brothers of Jesus in 1970, 3 years before his death. An influence on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Second Vatican Council, and the Christian Democratic Movement, he is one of the most important 20th century Catholic thinkers. In this interview, Professor Matthew Menard will take us through his pick of 5 of Maritain's books. Matthew Menard is a Ruthenian Catholic, husband, father, and a professor of philosophy and moral theology at St. Cyril and Methodius Byzantine Catholic Seminary in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His academic work has appeared in the journals Nova et Vetera, the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly, St. Anselm Journal, Lex Naturalis, Downside Review, the Review of Metaphysics, and Maritain Studies, as well as in volumes published by the American Maritain Association through the Catholic University of America Press. He served as author, translator, and editor for volumes published by the Catholic University of America Press, Emmaus Academic, Cluny Media, Ascension Press. He has published academic articles and book chapters related to Maritain and is secretary of the American Maritain Association. For more information on his work, visit philosophicalcatholic.com. So, Matthew, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Father, for having me.
Can you tell us about your research in general, and more specifically, what has motivated you to study Maritain and write on him?
Sure. My research in general was actually dissertation level, at least, was 14th century scholasticism and the metaphysics of logic. Some of the motivation for that was just the fact that it was underwritten on, so it was easier, less contestation in the secondary literature. But another reason as well is because I was interested in the early formation of kind of the Dominican flank of the Thomism. You know, I wouldn't necessarily call Hervaeus Natalis, on whom I did my dissertation, one of the exponents of the kind of high Thomistic school, but he was a significant voice there early on, and he did voice some positions in the metaphysics of logic that were pretty close to what Jean Poinceau or John of St. Thomas took, later on in the Baroque period of scholasticism. And so strangely, that fascination with the historical Thomist school came to me actually through Maritain. It was my interaction from the time that when I was a Roman Catholic, juridically at the time as a seminarian. I was assigned his degrees of knowledge, which actually converted me to Thomism. And throughout graduate school, I did write my licentiate thesis on the notion of history, how historicity plays into the knowledge of the natural law as a theme in Maritain's thought. And so throughout my licentiate studies and then my doctoral work, the whole oeuvre of Maritain was always on my shelf. For my licentiate, I combed through the whole of the corpus kind of a second time after reading everything, just to take notes. I still have an abundance of flashcards, so to speak, from those days. So Maritain became this really entree to something that was much older than the Neo-Scholastic period, because he was so heavily influenced through Humbert Clarissac and others, and of course Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, to read St. Thomas's thought through, especially the line of thought that has Cajetan, Thomas de Vio Cajetan, John of St. Thomas, and the Salamanca Carmelites, to a degree less, but even Charles-René Billouard, as main lights for doing one's Thomism. And so I just became, interested in his whole circle, almost as a kind of just organic growth of that world. So my continued work has been as a translator. I've done lots of stuff by the French Dominicans that are in his circle, number of volumes by Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, actually, but also Jean-Hervé Nicolas, who was very close to Maritain, Michel Labordette, Ambroise Gardet, who was half generation older than Garrigou, but for whom Maritain had a lot of respect as well. So I just, in the midst of this era of the church, have found myself, strangely as a Byzantine Catholic, still doing all this Latin stuff, but trying to read thinkers who are often thought. You spoke of his influence on the Second Vatican Council. Folks who are thought of as being sort of part of the mid-century turn toward themes in the Catholic world that then the post-conciliar church took up. So Maritain is often thought of as that, and yet he really is quite harmoniously connected to the past. And we live in an era of the church of a lot of squabbling, and I like to try to get people to talk to each other. So in my own soul, Maritain has reached back, all the way back into the 14th century in many ways, in my thought, let alone to St. Thomas. And so, sort of looking at the ongoing dialogue of thinkers that way has always been quite important for me, for my conception of Thomism, and I got it from him from the first moments of me being really a Thomist. Now, I would never recommend anyone that you start with the degrees of knowledge unless you're sure that God's going to move you in that direction. It was by accident. It's a very difficult book. I joke that I probably understood 5% of it at the time. I've refused to look at the paper I wrote on it for that epistemology class because it was probably so sophomoric. But it was still very important because you see in that book kind of the full swath of how he engaged with the sciences, but then also too, the main themes of Thomistic epistemology and metaphysics, and then also too, though, the debates over mysticism in St. John of the Cross, and the kind of epistemology that's necessary for discussing mystical experience. And you see it all in one big clip. The only thing that's really missing is the political side of Maritain. Maybe some of the aesthetics as well, but it's probably operative in his long footnotes. It's a great book for that, but it's also very difficult. So that's just a little bit about myself that way.
In your view, why should we read Maritain?
Yeah, so I think that we all need teachers, and so if you're a Thomist or a Westerner who reads St. Thomas Aquinas, you should read someone who is been more profoundly engaged with St. Thomas than probably you've been. And I say that to myself. He was, dedicated, in a way, dedicated his life to the reading of St. Thomas and his school in the modern world. You learn from Maritain, not merely Thomism, but you learn how to be an honest philosopher, how to see a philosopher work. Sometimes it's like whenever you're a young apprentice learning a craft, you'll kind of have the lowliest of jobs, sweeping things up and maybe, pounding a couple nails in. But of course, the purpose is that you're watching people go about their craft. And so just watching someone do their craft teaches you what the philosophical habitus is like. But, also as well, I think maybe this is the most important thing, actually. One of the risks that most scholastically inflected Catholics have or suffer from is a kind of historicism or a kind of repetition of the past. And I think that seeing a philosopher like Maritain or even his protege Yves Simon be a legitimate thinker is actually probably the most important of all aspects of his work. And he's a philosopher across all bounds, in aesthetics, in morals, in politics, in epistemology, in metaphysics, etc. And I just think learning that lesson prevents a kind of backward-looking Thomism, a sort of, in the words of John Deely, rear-view mirror Thomism. That really is the risk of, I think, almost any scholastically inflected thinker. Also, too, he keys you in on the intellectual scene of Catholicism from the 30s to the 60s in really interesting ways. And one of the books that we'll talk about today really will show that. Very interesting sort of open-minded man still looking at the many travails of the church around the time of the Second Vatican Council. And it shatters narratives. It's neither traditionalist, nor is it ressourcement, nor is it just Roman Thomistic. It's this honest look by a layman at what's going on at the time. So, yeah.
You've mentioned, or you've hinted at how Maritain faced criticism from other Catholic intellectuals. The great French historian of medieval philosophy, Etienne Jusson, believed that he became increasingly eclectic. Charles de Konig believed that his personalist political philosophy was overly individualist and parted from the traditional conception of the common good. How would you defend Maritain from criticisms such as these?
Yeah, the normal the normal the big place of critiquing Maritain is on questions political. Some of them are in the line of the Laval school of Charles de Konig, and some are more broadly in the line of certain theologians. I mean, even Garrigou-Lagrange was consulted on this in the 50s, as was Monsignor Fenton. And there was Jules de Mineville in South America, and I apologize that something just made a sound there. That Maritain does not really make a sufficient amount of room for the Christianization of the civic order itself. How does the indirect authority of the church really live itself out in the civic order? I think one of the books we'll talk about today actually shows that at least early in his career, he was quite well apprised of the indirect authority of the church in civic matters. And, I guess, truth be told, he was on the spectrum of the more democratically inflected thinkers of that period. Others like Journet were also in that line, especially given the question of, what we now talk about in terms of integralism. And I think that, even Garrigou thought that Maritain could get out of condemnation if he just wrote the right article that said how to explain his thought in view of the papal magisterium on the subordination of state to the church. On the common good issue, I don't know. I'm a bit more of the opinion of Yves Simon whenever he wrote in the Review of Politics that Charles de Konig's book really doesn't even address Maritain, and that as a position on St. Thomas's thought on the common good, it's pretty much in the same line as what Maritain himself thought, to be honest. But that the book is kind of useless for critiquing Maritain. And I don't like to be that dismissive, but I do think that Simone was keying into something, because nowhere in that book does Charles de Konig actually directly cite even Maritain. And Maritain was a bit of a naive child of, more left-focused French thinkers. I think he has some family connection to Ernst Renan, and he never lost that. And so, from what I understand, for instance, there's some verbiage about personalism and communitarianism that he used in the 40s that Emmanuel Mounier took up, and later on, Maritain actually said, he didn't like the direction that it was even used, but he kind of naively was comfortable with a more left-facing politic without self-criticism on it. So truth be told, I actually wished that he just had written a couple of the articles that Garrigou wished that he would have written, because it would have clarified, I think, his own thought, even regarding himself. He started out as a member of l'Action Française, somewhat on the peripheries, but if it hadn't been for l'Action Française, the conservative French movement, prior to their condemnation in the 20s, if it hadn't been for them, some of his first works would have been published, some of the sponsorship by folks there. And in his work on the primacy of the spiritual, or the things that are not Caesar's, you can still see that he has pretty much an awareness of the importance of kind of classical ecclesiology on the relationship of church and state. And he did shift. World War II shifted his mind and other things. And I wish he could sort of have harmonized the two sides of his mind. Gilson and Maritain were made to never understand each other in the end, because Gilson, just as much one could critique in his direction that he's a historicist, right? He's very much a historian of thought, and his idea of Thomism is to know St. Thomas's thought, and that's it. This is what some of my people in my tribe of Thomism sometimes get vexed with Gilson concerning. Maritain, he does have, if you read his late life works in his 80s, he feels like he's a bit more doing his own Maritainism within Thomism. But I don't know. I think they had different ideas of what Thomism was to begin with, and that would just set them to be at a sort of opposition. Well, only thing I can say is that Maritain was always, at least publicly, I think, kinder towards Gilson. That Gilson occasionally would take swipes like this. He also was kind late in life. We have to be very balanced there. But there's two very different views of Thomism, and I have strong feelings on this. And the semiotician John Dealey influenced me. He's kind of an anti-Gilsonian, and in my more petulant, more youthful days, 7-8 years ago, I was a bit anti-Gilsonian, even though I had gained so much from him. But it was fated to happen that someone who is a historian and a medievalist philosopher, both historian and philosopher like Gilson, is going to look at Maritain, who basically thinks of Thomism as, I'm reared in a certain tradition, but I'm thinking today, and I'm going to call it Thomism as well. They're just going to critique each other.
The first book you've chosen in Maritain is The Angelic Doctor, The Life and Thought of St. Thomas. This was originally published in 1929. Since then, of course, more authoritative biographies of St. Thomas have appeared, such as Weishaipel's and Jean-Pierre Trohel's. Is Maritain's book worth reading to understand his take on St. Thomas and the place of Thomism in his own thought then?
Yeah, and I was flipping through the text, of course, to prepare. It's been a while since I had read it. Of course, one should always remember, the age of it. When you see the tables of St. Thomas's works, I had to think. I just recently finished working on the third edition of Jean-Pierre Trohel's biography. It's coming out, and I was helping update the edits on it, and I couldn't help but think, okay, some of this is out of date, but the book still stands as a really good testament to when people talk about what neo-scholasticism looked like at the turn of the century. There are all kinds of tales that people tell about it. Well, here you're seeing a kind of first-person sort of account. Yes, somewhat historical in the first chapter, but then an account of what is St. Thomas for our own day? And so, it's a reflection by a man who had already been writing quite a bit in the Thomist tradition, and you do get a sense for some of the what do we say, triumphalism of the era. This is something I notice a little bit more sometimes looking from the Byzantine East. When you look back now on this, you realize how triumphalistic some of these scholastics were, but also as well, just I don't know, a way of getting into his mind of what he thinks Thomism is. So if you're thinking of who is Maritain in general, he doesn't merely look back to the 13th century of Thomas, but you see, sort of his comments on the history of the reception of St. Thomas by various popes, and then, the school, and then even the thought of how Thomism relates, its various branches relate to each other. Thomism as theology, Thomism as philosophy, Thomism in relationship to the modern sciences, which is such a dear topic to him. All of that comes up just in passing, because he can't help himself when he's in a more first-person mood to start meandering a bit into his own reception and his own thought. I mean, his own sort of, there is a kind of Maritain spiel. It doesn't repeat, but you recognize it, that he's being himself as well. So you see some of those themes come out, but you also see it within the context of a kind of quasi-biographical, layout of St. Thomas. So it gives you a feel for the church of that era, which I think is very important today, just because, we're still in the aftermath of and kind of self-questioning of the Second Vatican Council. The whole 20th century still weighs on us today. So it's good to know what the ecclesial mind of the Latin Church was like in one of its main exponents at the time. It also gives you an entree, of course, into St. Thomas. That's fine. And a particular reading of St. Thomas. And then also Maritain's own thought, right? That I think that what he says here holds through the whole of his career. No matter how sort of a little bit weird he gets later on, he is rather consistent throughout. So it does give you a sense for his Thomism. Even where he starts engaging more in contemporary political matters and other things.
And it's said that behind every great man, there's a great woman. In Maritain's case, it is his wife, Raissa. She was an intellectual in her own right. She introduced her husband to the writings of St. Thomas and is his co-author in the next book you've picked, Prayer and Intelligence. They describe the work as an attempt to disentangle his state as clearly as possible in the spirit of Christian tradition and of St. Thomas the main directions which seem suitable to the spiritual life of persons living in the world and occupied in intellectual pursuits. Presumably, you've chosen this work to showcase Maritain's spirituality. Does the guidance that he and Reiser give still hold up today?
Yeah, it's a lovely little book that was just republished, I think, by Clooney Press. So I tried to pick things that one could get nowadays. And so, both of them, I mean, they were Josephite married, and early on they were Benedictine oblates. They had a very strict horarium for a number of years there at the beginning of their life, and they always thought of themselves as a little household that had a certain kind of quasi-monastic life. I mean, even when they became more engaged in things of the world, and Vera Usmanov, Rais's sister, lived with them as well, and they were just sort of this little community that lived on both sides of the Atlantic together. And I think that this text, and I picked it exactly for the reason of showcasing the particular spiritual theology that he got. I mean, he got it from Garrigou-Lagrange in particular. So all of the mysticism of the Carmelite line that was sort of in the vogue and being debated at that time was really important to both of the Maritains. And it's just a lovely little 70-page book. I mean, my edition's 56 pages, where he just goes through, basically what would be, at much Fusius, much more broadly, at much greater length, in something like the three ages of the spiritual life, or the love of God, the cross of Jesus, or something like that in Garrigou-Lagrange. So the themes of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, prayer and infused wisdom, how to think philosophically, and yet subordinate your being a person of the mind to theology and the life of faith. It's all kind of in there in seed in just these little tiny chapters, very accessible. It takes a certain sort of erudition. It's written for intellectuals, but I mean, it's accessible, and it's quite meditative in its tone. So it gives you an entree then into, maybe if you're more interested in technical matters concerning his thought spiritually, then you can kind of turn to the works in the second half of the Degrees of Knowledge, or some of his other essays. And again, it's a constant line. The general spiritual physiognomy of the Maritains remains about the same wherever they're at. People change, people adapt, but the sort of essence of his spirituality lasts all the way into his days when he's writing as an old man and as a member of the Brothers of Jesus, Little Brothers.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview, or to support this podcast, visit the website 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast on the platform of your choice so that more people can discover it, and give it a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Until next time, God bless.